Okay, so for today's topic, we're going to be talking about how did the Korean War extend the Cold War into Asia. And I want you to think about the Truman Doctrine and the creation of the Truman Doctrine, and how would the Truman Doctrine and the creation of NATO, how is this going to kind of shape our foreign policy going through the post-World War II era. So the first question is, how did the end of World War II affect Korea? Now, Korea was part of the Japanese Empire until 1945. If you remember, after the Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese actually annexed Korea. So at the end of World War II, Korea was partitioned between the U.S. and the Soviets. And the reason why it was partitioned between the U.S. and the Soviets is because the Soviets, after Germany was defeated, helped us to do a final defeat of Japan. So Korea is divided up similarly to how Germany was divided up, and similar to how Germany was divided up with the purpose of eventually it being reunified, just for the purpose of kind of like getting the Japanese out of Korea. However, we all know as that did not really work very well with the Germans. It didn't work very well with the Koreans. And in 1948, we see the establishment of two separate Korean states, a communist North Korea and a pro-democracy South Korea, divided up along the 38th parallel, that being the line of latitude, what marks the division between the two countries. Each state of Korea claimed sovereignty over the other, meaning North Korea claimed that they controlled all of Korea and South Korea claimed that they controlled all of Korea. So there was a dispute as to actually should Korea be divided. Each side was also armed, the North by the Soviets and the South by the Americans, but then we both withdrew from the country. So this actually leads us to the start of the Korean War, which starts in 1950 and goes until 1953. And so what happens is, here you can see the divided up North and South Korea. And so on June 25th, 1950, North Korea, in a surprise attack, so I'll write that down again. That was June 25th, 1950. North Korea is going to invade South Korea in a surprise attack. And we, the U.S., felt that this attack was sanctioned by Russia. So as a result, we went to the UN asking for a force to stop the aggression in North Korea. And what then managed to happen after I erase this is that we managed to push the forces beyond the 38th parallel. So we pushed North Korea back beyond the 38th parallel. But MacArthur, who was the general in charge of this, who was also like a war hero from World War II, he continued with the advance and pushed American troops even further with the desire to reunite the country under a pro-U.S. government. However, this took us very close to the border of Korea and China did not like that. China took U.S. aggression as a threat to their national interest and sent 300,000 troops in to aid the North Koreans, which then they managed to push us all the way back almost to and take over almost the whole of the Korean Peninsula, and then we managed to push them back, and basically we were able to push the troops back to the 38th parallel, and the war ends in a stalemate in July of 1953. In a stalemate, which means it's basically a tie. They agree to disagree. And 3 million people died in this conflict, most of those people being Korean civilians. And here you can see some of the movements of the troops. You could see that North Korea does almost eventually get, almost all of the Korean peninsula minus this little area here, and then they're pushed back, and then the Chinese get involved, and then we and the South Koreans get pushed back, and eventually it just all decides to agree to disagree at the 38th parallel. So this is a ceasefire. So technically, We're still in a state of war with North Korea, which is why North Korea kind of gets very aggressive at times. Doesn't like the fact that we have lots of marine bases to this day still in South Korea. In the 38th parallel, which is the border between North and South Korea, is one of the most heavily armed borders in the world. So you can see some of the devastation of the Korean countryside, some of the fighting that was going on during the duration of the war. And you can see we were pretty much answering these questions already, so I kind of skipped ahead by accident, but how did these intensify tensions in Asia? So the fear was that if, this goes back to the whole concept of the domino theory. The fear being that if South Korea goes communist, then potentially the rest of Asia will go communist, especially after China goes communist. So the fear was, didn't want to let North Korea take over and get control of Korea. So here you can see this is pictures of the 38th parallel. We still have troops on the 38th parallel because technically, like I said, we're still kind of in a state of war. So how did the Korean War impact Cold War tensions? So we regarded North Korea as a part of a communist conspiracy to take over the world, this whole domino theory. So that's why we began to provide military protection and economic aid to other non-communist governments in Asia. And something called, let me get a better color here. I don't know if that's necessarily a better color, but CETA was formed, which is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, kind of like the Southeast Asian version of NATO. So we had a treaty, mutual defense treaty like NATO, with the desire to keep the rest of Asia from becoming communist. And you probably are pretty aware today, but North Korea is one of the most secretive nations in the world. And if you look at this is a map of Korea at night, and you could see this whole cluster of lights. This whole cluster of lights here, this is the area around Seoul, which is a major metropolitan area, whereas North Korea, this is Pyongyang, and then the rest of it is all dark because there's been lots of sanctions against the North Koreans. In addition, North Korea is facing very severe shortages as far as food. They don't really have electricity. Obviously, look here. Seoul is one of the, premier cities in Asia, very cosmopolitan and developed. You can see here, this is the Seoul subway system, very crowded, very vibrant city. In contrast, here you can see this is Pyongyang, a very different city, very few cars on the street. You actually have women who work as stoplights rather than actually having stoplights. So these are the members of CETA, Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. This is a quote from President Eisenhower explaining the whole concept of the domino theory, that with respect to more people passing under this domination, Asia, after all, has already lost some 450 million of its people to the communist dictatorship. We simply cannot afford greater losses. But when we come to the possible sequence of events, the loss of Indochina, which would be Vietnam, of Burma, of Thailand, of the peninsula, and Indonesia following, now you begin to talk about areas that not only multiply the disadvantages that you would suffer through the loss of materials, source of materials, but now you are talking about millions and millions and millions of people. Finally, the geographical position achieved thereby does many things. It turns the so-called island defensive chain of Japan for most of the Philippines and to the southward. It moves in to threaten Australia and New Zealand. It takes away in its economic aspects that region that Japan must have as a trading area, or Japan in turn will have only one place in the world to go, that is towards the communist areas, in order to live. So the possible consequences of the loss are just incalculable to the free world. So the summary question, this was a short video. Why was Korea so important to the U.S. containment policies in the 1950s, and did Korea benefit from U.S. intervention in Korea? So I want you to think about that as we move on to the next topic, which is going to be communist Cuba.